Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
My husband's smug voice on the phone didn't faze me, even when he said he'd sold our apartment and was starting a new life with his girlfriend. I simply replied, "Sounds good," and hung up. But what he didn't know was that I had a surprise waiting for him, one that would wipe that smirk off his face for good. The fluorescent lights of the hotel conference room hummed softly as I wrapped up my presentation. The client, a sharp-dressed woman in her 40s, nodded appreciatively while I outlined the final details of our proposal. It was a high-stakes meeting, one that could mean a massive contract for my company, and I was running on adrenaline, fueled by weeks of preparation. Just as I was about to ask if there were any final questions, my phone buzzed on the table beside my laptop. The name on the screen made my stomach twist. Mark. My husband rarely called when I was traveling for work, and when he did, it was usually for something trivial, like asking where I'd put the dry cleaning receipt. But something about the timing and the way his name seemed to glare at me from the screen told me this wasn't one of those calls. "Excuse me for just a moment," I said, flashing the client an apologetic smile before stepping into the hallway. I swiped to answer. "Mark." His voice came through the line, oozing with smugness. "Hey, just thought I'd let you know, I'm divorcing you." "Oh, and I've already sold our apartment, so don't bother coming back. I'm starting a new life with my girlfriend. Enjoy looking for a new place." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. For a moment, I couldn't speak, couldn't think. My grip tightened on the phone as I stared at the beige hotel hallway, my mind racing to process what he had just said. But then, something surprising happened. A strange calm washed over me, like the eye of a storm. "Sounds good," I replied, my tone so neutral it even surprised me. Mark hesitated, probably expecting an explosion of anger or a flood of tears. "That's it? Sounds good?" he asked, his smugness faltering for just a moment. "Yes, Mark," I said evenly. "Sounds good. Thanks for letting me know." Before he could respond, I hung up. As I slid my phone back into my pocket, I allowed myself a deep breath. Inside, my emotions were swirling. Anger, disbelief, betrayal. But I refused to let them take over. I straightened my blazer, smoothed my hair, and walked back into the conference room with a composed smile. "Sorry about that," I said as I resumed my seat. Where were we? The rest of the meeting passed in a blur, though I managed to maintain my professionalism, answering questions and making confident assurances. When the client shook my hand at the end, she smiled warmly. "You're incredibly poised under pressure," she said. "We'll be in touch." Little did she know just how much pressure I was under at that moment. Back in my hotel room that evening, I replayed Mark's words over and over. He had always been self-centered, but this was a new low, even for him. Selling the apartment? Announcing a divorce with a casual phone call? Starting a new life with his girlfriend, as if it was some kind of grand upgrade? I should have been devastated, but instead I felt resolved. Mark's arrogance had always been his weakness, and now it was going to be his downfall. The first thing I did was open my laptop and draft an email to my lawyer. Subject: Urgent divorce proceedings. "Hi. I need to discuss my husband's recent actions, including the illegal sale of our apartment. Please let me know your availability for a call tomorrow. Best, Lauren." With that email sent, I felt the first glimmer of control return. Mark had blindsided me, but what he didn't realize was that his little announcement had handed me all the leverage I needed. I spent the rest of the evening going through our financial records. I had always been meticulous about keeping copies of everything, a habit Mark had mocked as being overly cautious. Now, I was grateful for it. As I pored over the documents, I noticed something curious. The apartment sale had been finalized unusually quickly, almost suspiciously so. My name was still on the deed, which meant Mark had no legal right to sell it without my consent. I smirked. He thought he had outsmarted me, but he had just made a critical mistake. Mark had underestimated me for years, always assuming I would stay quiet, compliant, and easily manipulated. But that version of me was gone. I wasn't just going to sit back and let him walk away unscathed. Tomorrow, I would start taking back everything he thought he had taken from me. This wasn't just a setback. It was the beginning of a plan. By the time I returned to my hotel room, the initial sting of Mark's betrayal had transformed into a cold, calculating determination. His arrogance wasn't just insulting. It was a fatal flaw, and I was going to make sure he paid for every ounce of it. The first thing I did was pace the length of the room, letting the tension bleed off as I strategized. Mark had always underestimated me, mistaking my calm demeanor for passivity. But what he never realized was that I had spent years quietly observing his every move, filing away details that might one day prove useful. That day had come. I grabbed my laptop from the desk and opened my email, drafting a message to my lawyer. Subject: Urgent legal inquiry. Hi, Susan. I just learned that my husband, Mark, has sold our apartment without my consent. He's also stated that he's divorcing me. Can you confirm the legal standing of the sale and advise on the next steps? I've attached a copy of the deed and our financial records for context. Best regards, Lauren. Satisfied, I hit send. While I waited for Susan's response, I went into full-on detective mode. I started by pulling up every document I could think of: bank statements, tax filings, insurance policies, and the most recent communication about the apartment. I had always kept meticulous records, a habit Mark used to mock as overkill. Now, those records were going to be my greatest weapon. As I sifted through the files, I noticed something strange. The sale of the apartment had been finalized with lightning speed, just days before Mark's phone call. Not only that, but the sale price was far below market value. It didn't take a genius to figure out what had happened. Mark had rushed through the transaction, likely hoping I wouldn't notice until it was too late. But he had underestimated two things: my attention to detail and my willingness to fight back. The next morning, Susan called me. Her tone was as serious as I expected. Lauren, I've reviewed the documents you sent. Mark did sell the apartment, but here's the kicker. He couldn't legally do so without your consent. Your name is still on the deed, which means the sale is invalid. I let out a slow breath, equal parts relief and fury. So, what does that mean for me? It means we can file a suit to nullify the sale, Susan explained. The buyer will have to return the property to joint ownership, and Mark will face legal repercussions for fraud. But that's not all. We can also leverage this to strengthen your position in the divorce. His actions demonstrate bad faith, which could work heavily in your favor during the settlement. Hearing those words sent a jolt of energy through me. What's the next step? I'll file an injunction to freeze the transaction, Susan said. In the meantime, I need you to gather as much information as you can about Mark's assets, spending habits, and anything else that might be relevant. The more evidence we have, the better our case will be. Consider it done, I replied. Over the next several days, I became a woman on a mission. Between client meetings and travel commitments, I dedicated every spare moment to uncovering the full extent of Mark's betrayal. First, I dove into his financial history. I accessed joint accounts, credit card statements, and even the investment portfolios he thought I knew nothing about. What I found was both infuriating and enlightening. A series of large withdrawals over the past 6 months, coinciding with weekends he claimed to be working late. Next, I turned my attention to his new girlfriend. A quick social media search revealed that Vanessa, yes, I found her name, was an aspiring influencer with a taste for luxury. Her posts featured designer bags, fine dining, and tropical vacations, often with captions like, "Living my best life." The kicker? Several of those luxury items had been purchased using our joint funds. Armed with this information, I scheduled a follow-up call with Susan. He's been funneling money out of our accounts, I said, forwarding her the screenshots. And he's been using it to bankroll his girlfriend's lifestyle. Susan sighed. This is exactly the kind of evidence we need. Not only does it show financial misconduct, but it also strengthens your case for recovering a larger portion of the marital assets. I leaned back in my chair, a sense of vindication washing over me. For years, Mark had painted himself as the responsible, successful husband while subtly undermining me at every turn. Now his carefully constructed facade was crumbling, and I was holding the hammer. The final piece of the puzzle came when Susan uncovered the identity of the buyer who had purchased our apartment. It turned out to be a shell company, likely created to facilitate a quick and discreet sale. The more we dug, the more obvious it became that Mark had orchestrated the entire scheme to fund his new life with Vanessa. With every discovery, my resolve grew stronger. Mark had thought he could blindside me and walk away unscathed. He had no idea that his actions were the spark I needed to take back control. As I packed my bags to return home, I felt a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in years. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about justice. Mark thought he was starting a new chapter. He had no idea that I was about to rewrite the entire book. When my flight touched down, I wasn't sure what to expect. Mark's smug announcement still echoed in my head, and I couldn't help but imagine arriving to a scene straight out of a bad movie. My belongings scattered on the street, my name scratched off the buzzer, and a for sale sign mocking me from the front lawn. Instead, the building stood just as I'd left it. The doorman greeted me with his usual nod, and I stepped into the elevator with my suitcase. heart pounding. As I unlocked the apartment door and pushed it open, I was struck by the eerie quiet. The place wasn't trashed, but it was disturbingly empty. Mark had clearly packed up everything he deemed valuable, leaving behind the scraps, a crooked lamp in the corner, a single chair at the dining table, and a pile of unopened junk mail on the floor. My footsteps echoed on the hardwood, amplifying the silence. It felt surreal. This had been our home for years, a space filled with arguments, apologies, laughter, and everything in between. Now it was just a hollow shell. I didn't waste any time. After a brief walkthrough to confirm Mark and his new girlfriend weren't lurking somewhere, I picked up the phone and called a locksmith. "I need the locks changed today," I told them, my tone leaving no room for negotiation. Within the hour, a technician was drilling away at the front door. As I watched, a small but defiant smile tugged at my lips. Mark might have thought he'd closed the door on me, but I was the one securing it for good. Once the new locks were installed, I made my next call to the realtor who had facilitated the apartment's sale. It didn't take long to find their name from the transaction records I'd uncovered with Susan's help. "Hi, this is Lauren Parker," I said when they answered. My voice was polite but firm, the kind of tone I reserve for situations where I wasn't about to take no for an answer. "I'm one of the owners of the apartment you recently sold." The realtor hesitated. "Oh, I wasn't aware of any co-owner involvement in the sale." "Exactly," I replied. "That's the problem. I need details about the buyer. And I need them now." The realtor's nervousness was palpable, even over the phone. At first, they tried to dodge my questions, muttering something about confidentiality. But after I reminded them that the sale had been fraudulent and that I had already involved my lawyer, they started to sing. "The buyer is listed as a corporate entity," they admitted. But, well, between us, the whole thing was handled unusually fast. It wasn't my typical transaction. "Go on," I urged, my pen poised over a notepad. "The offer came in just a few days before the sale closed," the realtor continued. "It was significantly below market value, but the seller, your husband, seemed eager to move forward. I didn't question it at the time, but in hindsight," their voice trailed off, guilt creeping in. "Do you have contact information for the buyer?" I pressed. "Yes, I do. I'll email it to you," they said reluctantly. After hanging up, I sat at the kitchen counter, staring at my notes. Everything about the sale screamed desperation. Mark had likely orchestrated the deal in a rush, thinking he could pocket the money and disappear into his shiny new life with Vanessa before I even knew what hit me. But his recklessness had created cracks in his plan, cracks I was more than ready to exploit. I spent the rest of the evening piecing together what I could about the buyer, starting with the information the realtor had sent me. The corporate entity listed as the purchaser was a shell company with no discernible operations, likely created for the sole purpose of making the transaction appear legitimate. A quick online search revealed that the company's registered agent had ties to several other questionable deals, all involving properties sold far below their market value. It was clear this wasn't just a simple sale, it was part of a larger scheme, and Mark had walked straight into it. The more I uncovered, the angrier I became, not just at Mark, but at myself for ever trusting him. This was the man I had built a life with, the man I had once believed in. And yet, here he was, dragging me into the middle of a fraudulent mess, all to fund his ridiculous fantasy with Vanessa. But anger wasn't going to solve anything. What I needed now was focus. I emailed all the new information to Susan, adding detailed notes about my findings. "This is getting bigger than we thought," I wrote. "Let me know how we can use this to strengthen our case." Her reply came quickly. "You've given me plenty to work with. Let's strategize tomorrow." As I closed my laptop, I looked around the empty apartment, the weight of the situation pressing down on me. But instead of feeling defeated, I felt something else: resolve. This wasn't just about reclaiming my home or my financial stability. This was about standing up for myself, about proving to Mark, and to me, that I wasn't someone who could be cast aside so easily. Mark had made his move, but now it was my turn, and I was going to make sure it was checkmate. After my conversation with the realtor and a few pointed inquiries with Susan, the picture of Mark's new life started to come into focus. It wasn't hard to find Vanessa. Between social media oversharing and public records tied to the apartment sale, her name popped up repeatedly. Vanessa Porter, 27, self-proclaimed lifestyle influencer, and, based on her Instagram feed, a woman with a penchant for luxury far beyond what Mark could afford. Designer bags, private dinners at high-end restaurants, and vacations to tropical destinations were all prominently featured in her posts. Each photo was accompanied by captions about living the dream and treating yourself. The irony wasn't lost on me. Mark had accused me of being too cautious with money throughout our marriage, but here he was, draining our accounts to fund a lavish lifestyle with a woman who thought budgeting was a dirty word. The more I dug, the more I realized that Vanessa wasn't just a passive participant in Mark's schemes. She was the architect. Their social media interactions painted a clear picture. She had pushed him to sell the apartment. One post from Vanessa featured a photo of her lounging in what looked like a furniture showroom, with the caption, "Starting fresh, out with the old, in with the new. Exciting times ahead." The timestamp? 3 days after the apartment sale was finalized. Mark had commented, "To new beginnings," followed by his usual flair for grand declarations. It was nauseating, but it also gave me exactly what I needed: confirmation that Vanessa was deeply involved in the fraudulent sale. One evening, after a particularly frustrating day, I decided to take a detour on my way home. Armed with the address Susan had uncovered, I drove to the small rental where Mark and Vanessa were now living. The neighborhood was a far cry from the upscale part of town where our apartment was located. The houses were modest, and the apartment complex they had moved into looked run down, with peeling paint and a cracked driveway. I parked a few houses down and walked to their building, my heels clicking softly against the pavement. From the outside, I could see their unit on the second floor. The lights were on, and their shadows moved behind thin, cheap curtains. A muffled laugh floated down to the street, followed by Mark's familiar voice. I stood there for a moment, taking it all in. This was what Mark had traded our life for: a shabby rental with mismatched furniture and a girlfriend who couldn't stop posting about her new designer bag. But instead of anger, I felt something else: satisfaction. As I watched their silhouettes, a plan began to form in my mind. This wasn't about revenge, it was about justice. Mark and Vanessa thought they had outsmarted me, but they had no idea what was coming. I snapped a quick photo of the building, making a mental note to send it to Susan for documentation. Then, without a word, I turned and walked back to my car. The next day, I shared my findings with Susan. Vanessa was the driving force behind the apartment sale, I said, forwarding her the screenshots and posts I'd collected. She's in this as much as Mark is, if not more. Susan nodded thoughtfully. We can use this. If Vanessa benefited financially from the fraudulent sale, she could be held liable as well. And based on what you found, she definitely benefited. The idea of pulling Vanessa into the legal crosshairs felt fitting. She had inserted herself into my life, convincing Mark to betray me further than he already had. Now, it was time for her to face the consequences. In the days that followed, I worked tirelessly with Susan to build our case. Every piece of evidence we uncovered painted a damning picture of Mark and Vanessa's deceit. The fraudulent sale, the misused funds, the paper trail of their reckless spending. It all added up. Meanwhile, I kept an eye on Vanessa's social media. Her posts were as tone-deaf as ever. Pictures of expensive meals, luxury shopping bags, and captions about how hard work pays off. I couldn't wait to see her face when she realized that the world she had built on lies was about to come crashing down. Mark and Vanessa had made their choices, and now they would have to face the consequences. As I prepared for the next phase of my plan, I couldn't help but smile. This wasn't just about winning, it was about reclaiming my power. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I needed to be. I hadn't planned on confronting Mark and Vanessa so soon, but when an opportunity presented itself, I couldn't resist. After weeks of gathering evidence and coordinating with Susan, I finally felt ready to let them know exactly what they were up against. Armed with a folder of legal documents and a resolve that wouldn't waver, I drove back to their shabby apartment one evening. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the cracked pavement as I parked a few spaces away. My heart pounded as I walked up the steps to their unit, but I forced myself to stay calm. I knocked twice, the sound echoing in the quiet hallway. After a few moments, the door swung open, and there he was, Mark. His face went through a rapid series of emotions: surprise, confusion, and finally, a flicker of panic. "What are you doing here?" he sputtered, gripping the edge of the door as if to steady himself. I smiled, the kind of smile that sent a clear message. I wasn't here to play games. "I came to talk," I said evenly. "About the apartment sale. You might want to let me in." Mark hesitated, glancing over his shoulder as if hoping Vanessa would magically appear to save him. And she did. "What's going on?" Vanessa's voice rang out before she stepped into view. She was wearing a silk robe, her hair pulled back into a sleek ponytail. Her expression shifted to irritation the moment she saw me. "It's about the apartment," I said, stepping forward so I could address them both. Specifically, the fact that the sale was illegal. Mark's face drained of color, but Vanessa rolled her eyes. You can't just show up here and make accusations, she snapped, crossing her arms. The sale is final. We've moved on, and you should too. I tilted my head, pulling a copy of the deed from my folder. Actually, I replied, my tone calm but firm, because my name is still on the deed. That means Mark had no legal right to sell the property without my consent. Vanessa's bravado faltered for a moment before she scoffed. Even if that's true, what are you going to do about it? I met her glare head-on. I've already done it. I filed a lawsuit against both of you for fraud. The silence that followed was deafening. Mark looked like he might faint, while Vanessa's face twisted in a mix of disbelief and anger. You can't be serious, she said, her voice rising. Oh, I'm very serious, I replied, pulling out another document and handing it to Mark. This is a copy of the injunction we filed to freeze the sale. The buyer has been notified, and the court is already reviewing the case. If you think you can bluff your way out of this, you're sorely mistaken. Mark finally found his voice, though it was shaky. This is ridiculous, Lauren. You can't just come in here and threaten us with legal nonsense. It's not nonsense, Mark, I said, my tone sharp. It's the law. And if you had bothered to think this through instead of rushing to fund your little fantasy life, you might have realized that. Vanessa's anger boiled over. You're just bitter because Mark left you, she spat. You can't stand the fact that we're happy without you. I laughed, a cold, humorless sound. Happy? Is that what you call this? I gestured around at their shabby apartment. You sold a luxury apartment for pennies and moved into this. All because you thought you could pull one over on me. Trust me, Vanessa, I'm not bitter. I'm just here to make sure you face the consequences of your actions. Mark sank onto the couch, burying his face in his hands. This is a nightmare, he muttered. Vanessa whirled on him. You said this was handled. You said she couldn't do anything about it. I thought it was. Mark snapped back, his frustration evident. How was I supposed to know she'd fight back like this? I watched their exchange with quiet satisfaction. For years, Mark had underestimated me, assuming I would always back down, always play the role of the supportive wife who never rocked the boat. But this time, I was the one holding the cards, and it was clear neither of them knew how to deal with it. As their bickering escalated, I stepped toward the door. I'll leave you two to sort this out, I said, my voice cutting through their argument. But don't get too comfortable. This is just the beginning. You're going to be hearing a lot more from my lawyer. Vanessa turned back to me, her face twisted in fury. You think you've won? This isn't over. No, I said, my tone icy. It's not. But when it is, I'll be the one standing. Count on it. As I walked out into the cool night air, I felt an unexpected sense of relief. Confronting them had been draining, but it was also empowering. For so long, I had let Mark control the narrative, dictate how I felt, and what I believed about myself. But now, the power had shifted. They thought they could rewrite the story without me. But they had forgotten one crucial detail. I wasn't just a footnote. I was the main character. The fight was far from over, but as I drove away from their dingy apartment, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to stop until justice was served. The day of the trial arrived, and as I sat outside the courtroom with my lawyer, Susan, I felt a mix of nerves and determination. The stakes were high, but I knew we had built a solid case. Every document, email, and transaction we'd uncovered was meticulously organized in the thick binder Susan carried. Remember, she said, her tone calm but firm, the truth is on your side. Let their lies trip them up. Just focus on staying composed, and let me handle the heavy lifting. I nodded, taking a deep breath as the bailiff called us in. Mark and Vanessa were already seated at the defendant's table when we entered. Mark's suit was slightly too big, as though he'd lost weight since I'd last seen him. Vanessa, on the other hand, was dressed to impress, her hair perfectly styled and her expression cold. She glanced at me briefly before turning away, her confidence as brittle as the thin heels she teetered on. The judge, a no-nonsense woman with sharp eyes, began the proceedings. Susan rose to present our opening statement, outlining the fraudulent sale of the apartment and how Mark and Vanessa had knowingly violated the law. They attempted to sell a property jointly owned by my client without her consent, Susan stated. Not only is this a breach of property law, but it also demonstrates a pattern of deliberate deception. Mark's lawyer, a man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, rose to argue their case. His defense leaned heavily on the claim that Mark believed he had full authority to sell the apartment. It was an honest mistake, the lawyer said, glancing nervously at the judge. Mr. Parker assumed he had the right to handle the sale independently, given his financial contributions to the property. Susan wasted no time dismantling this narrative. One by one, she presented the evidence. First came the deed, with both my name and Mark's clearly listed as co-owners. Then came the emails between Mark and the realtor, in which he explicitly instructed them to proceed with the sale despite knowing my consent was required. Next came the financial records. Susan highlighted the suspiciously low sale price of the apartment, pointing out how it was far below market value. She then presented proof of where the money had gone: luxury purchases, trips, and even cash deposits into Vanessa's personal account. The courtroom was silent as Susan flipped through slide after slide, each one painting a damning picture of Mark and Vanessa's actions. Not only did Mr. Parker and Ms. Porter engage in a fraudulent sale, Susan concluded, but they also misappropriated joint funds for personal gain, further demonstrating their bad faith. When it was Vanessa's turn to testify, her confidence began to crumble. "We didn't mean to do anything wrong," she said, her voice tight with frustration. "Mark told me everything was handled." Susan raised an eyebrow. "So you didn't think to verify that the sale was legal before accepting money into your personal account?" Vanessa fidgeted with the hem of her blouse. I didn't think it was my responsibility." "And yet," Susan pressed, "you directly benefited from the proceeds of this illegal sale. Would you consider that an honest mistake?" Vanessa stammered, her composure slipping further with every question. By the time she stepped down, even Mark was glaring at her. Mark's testimony wasn't much better. He tried to frame himself as the victim of a misunderstanding, claiming he didn't realize he needed my consent to sell the apartment. But Susan was ready for him. "Mr. Parker," she began, holding up an email he had sent to the realtor. "In this message, you explicitly state, 'Don't worry about my wife's signature. I'll handle it.' Can you explain what you meant by that?" Mark's face turned red. I was just trying to speed things up. I didn't think it would be an issue." "So you knowingly bypassed your wife's legal rights as a co-owner?" Susan asked. Mark mumbled something incoherent, avoiding eye contact. The judge's expression grew increasingly impatient as the trial dragged on. By the time closing arguments began, it was clear that Mark and Vanessa's defense was in shambles. When the ruling finally came, it was swift and decisive. "The court finds the sale of the property to be invalid," the judge declared, her voice firm. "The property will be returned to joint ownership, and the defendants, Mr. Parker and Ms. Porter, are ordered to pay damages to the plaintiff for fraudulent actions and legal fees." Mark slumped in his seat, his face pale. Vanessa looked furious, her hands clenched into fists. As I listened to the judge's words, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Justice had been served. After the trial, Susan and I stood outside the courthouse, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows on the steps. "You did it," she said with a small smile. "No," I replied, shaking my head. "We did it." The fight wasn't over. There was still paperwork to finalize, damages to collect, and the apartment to deal with. But for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. Mark and Vanessa had tried to take everything from me, but they had failed. And as I walked away from the courthouse that day, I knew one thing for certain: they would never have power over me again. The first thing I did after the court ruled in my favor was walk back into the apartment that had been the source of so much turmoil. It was quiet, still stripped bare of anything remotely personal, but this time it felt different. It was mine again, not a battleground or a bargaining chip, but a piece of my life that I had reclaimed. However, as much as I appreciated the symbolic victory, I knew I didn't want to stay there. The apartment was a reminder of everything I had been through with Mark, a space that held too many memories of arguments, control, and the shadow of someone I no longer was. So I made the decision to sell it, this time legally and on my own terms. Working with a reputable realtor, I listed the apartment at market value and watched as interest flooded in. It turned out that the location and design still made it a hot commodity, and within weeks, I had multiple offers on the table. The process of finalizing the sale felt liberating, like closing the door on a chapter of my life that I was finally ready to leave behind. When the sale went through, I stood in the now empty living room one last time, taking a deep breath. I had come full circle, from being blindsided by Mark's betrayal to standing here as someone who had fought and won. With the money from the sale, I started searching for a new place to call home. This time, I was deliberate, choosing a neighborhood that felt warm and welcoming, far away from the cold sterility of the one I had shared with Mark. The new house I found was smaller, but filled with charm. It had big windows that let in the sunlight, a cozy kitchen with vintage tiles, and a small garden where I could plant flowers or herbs. It wasn't flashy, but it was perfect. Decorating it became a labor of love. I picked out furniture that reflected my style, hung art that brought me joy, and filled the shelves with books I'd always meant to read. I even indulged in little luxuries, a soft throw for the couch, a beautiful rug for the living room, and fairy lights for the garden. For the first time, I had a space that felt like me. There were no compromises, no subtle reminders of someone else's preferences. Every detail reflected the person I was becoming, strong, independent, and completely free. I hosted a small housewarming party with close friends, people who had supported me through everything. As we sipped wine and laughed in my new living room, I felt a warmth I hadn't experienced in years. Meanwhile, Mark's life was unraveling. News of the lawsuit had spread among his social and professional circles, and his reputation was in tatters. The story of how he and Vanessa had attempted to pull off a fraudulent sale made its way through mutual acquaintances, and people were quick to distance themselves from him. Vanessa, predictably, had bailed shortly after the trial. From what I heard, she couldn't handle the fallout or the financial strain of being part of a losing lawsuit. She moved on to another man with deeper pockets, leaving Mark to deal with the consequences on his own. The last I heard, Mark was living in a cramped studio apartment on the outskirts of the city. The man who once prided himself on his image, his tailored suits, his carefully curated life, was now scraping by, his arrogance replaced by desperation. As for me, I had never felt lighter. Each day in my new home felt like a fresh start, a chance to rebuild without the weight of the past dragging me down. I threw myself into my work, finding joy in the challenges and satisfaction in the victories. I started exploring hobbies I'd always put off, taking painting classes, joining a book club, and even trying my hand at gardening. More than anything, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't known in years. The life I was building wasn't about proving anything to anyone else. It was about living authentically on my own terms. One evening, as I sat in my garden watching the sun dip below the horizon, I thought about how far I had come. Mark's betrayal had been a catalyst, a painful but necessary push to reclaim my life. He had tried to take everything from me, but in the end, I had gained so much more: clarity, confidence, and a future that was mine alone. And for the first time in a long time, I was truly happy. The letter arrived on an ordinary Tuesday, tucked among the usual stack of bills and flyers. My name was scrawled across the envelope in handwriting I hadn't seen in months, and for a moment, I just stared at it. It was from Mark. I debated whether to open it at all. Part of me wanted to throw it in the trash unopened, to treat it with the same disregard he'd shown me when he'd sold our apartment and announced his new life over the phone. But curiosity won out, and I carefully slit the envelope, pulling out a single sheet of paper. His words were shaky, almost desperate, as if he'd written them in a rush of regret. "Lauren, I don't know where to start, so I'll just say I'm sorry. I know that probably doesn't mean much after everything I've done, but I need you to know that I regret it all. I made a mistake, a lot of mistakes, and I see that now. I thought leaving you and starting over with Vanessa was the answer, but it wasn't. She's gone, the money's gone, and I'm left with nothing but the realization of how much I threw away. You didn't deserve what I did to you. You were always there for me, and I took you for granted. I know I can't undo the past, but I hope someday you can forgive me. I'd like to talk, to explain myself, and maybe try to make amends. Mark." I read the letter twice, feeling a mix of emotions. It wasn't the first time Mark had offered an apology. During our marriage, there had been countless moments where he'd said the right things after an argument, promising to change, to do better. But those words had always been hollow, and this letter felt no different. The excuses he'd woven into his apology stood out like red flags. He regretted leaving because Vanessa had left him, because the money was gone, because his life was in shambles. Not because he truly understood the damage he'd caused. I folded the letter and set it aside. I didn't feel anger, nor did I feel the urge to forgive. What I felt was indifference, a surprising, liberating indifference that told me I didn't need his apology or his explanation. For so long, I had believed closure was something someone gave you. I thought I needed Mark to acknowledge the pain he'd caused, to admit his wrongdoing, to ask for forgiveness. But as I sat there in my sunlit kitchen, surrounded by the life I had built for myself, I realized closure wasn't something he could give me. I'd already found it. Closure wasn't about hearing the right words or having a heart-to-heart conversation. It was about reclaiming my power, my happiness, and my sense of self. Mark's letter was just a reminder of how far I had come, how much I had grown since the day I walked out of his shadow. I didn't reply to the letter. There was nothing to say. Mark was part of my past, a chapter one had closed for good. Engaging with him, even to acknowledge his apology, would only reopen wounds I had worked so hard to heal. Instead, I tucked the letter into a drawer and went about my day. Later that evening, as I watered the plants in my garden, I thought about the woman I used to be. The version of me who would have clung to that letter, dissecting every word, searching for meaning and validation. That woman was gone. In her place was someone stronger, someone who had faced betrayal, fought for justice, and emerged on the other side with a life that was entirely her own. The days turned into weeks, and Mark's letter became a distant memory. I didn't tell anyone about it, not because I was ashamed or hiding anything, but because it didn't matter. What mattered was the life I was living now, the friendships I was nurturing, the goals I was pursuing, and the peace I felt every time I walked into my new home. Mark had once been a defining part of my story, but now, he was just a footnote. As I sat on my porch one evening, watching the sky turn shades of pink and gold, I smiled to myself. This was closure, not tied to an apology or an explanation, but to the simple, beautiful fact that I had moved on. And that was all the validation I would ever need. In the months following the trial and Mark's feeble attempt at an apology, my life began to blossom in ways I hadn't anticipated. The weight of his betrayal, once a heavy anchor, had been lifted. Instead of looking back, I turned my focus forward, channeling my energy into building a life that felt purposeful and fulfilling. At work, I dove headfirst into every challenge that came my way. My success in handling the lawsuit had earned me a reputation for resilience, and my colleagues started looking to me for leadership on key projects. I found myself taking on roles that were once intimidating, but now felt like natural extensions of my growing confidence. One of the most exciting moments came when I was asked to lead an international project. It involved traveling to Europe for 3 weeks, working with teams across multiple countries. The opportunity was a dream come true, and it reminded me of the ambitious woman I had been before Mark's control had dimmed my aspirations. The trip was a whirlwind of late nights, strategic planning, and cultural immersion. During a rare free afternoon in Paris, I stood on the balcony of my hotel room, overlooking the Seine River. The city buzzed with life, and for the first time in years, I felt fully present. I realized then how far I had come. Mark had always dismissed my career ambitions as frivolous, suggesting my focus should be on supporting him rather than chasing my own dreams. But standing there, in a city I had always longed to visit, I knew I was exactly where I was meant to be, not because of him, but in spite of him. When I returned home, my accomplishments were celebrated by my team and recognized by senior leadership. The sense of fulfillment wasn't just about career success. It was about proving to myself that I was capable of thriving on my own terms. Outside of work, I made a point to reconnect with parts of myself that had been neglected during my marriage. I joined a local hiking group, rediscovering my love for nature and the sense of peace it brought me. On weekends, I took long drives to nearby trails, marveling at the simple beauty of the world around me. I also rekindled old friendships, meeting up with people I had lost touch with during my years with Mark. At first, I worried they might judge me for staying in a toxic relationship for as long as I had, but those fears quickly dissolved. My friends welcomed me back with open arms, and our conversations flowed effortlessly, filled with laughter and genuine connection. One evening, over dinner with my college roommate, Sarah, she said something that stuck with me. "You're glowing, Lauren. It's like you've rediscovered yourself." She was right. I felt like I had peeled back the layers of self-doubt and fear that Mark had wrapped around me, revealing a version of myself that was stronger, freer, and more self-assured. Travel also became a passion. Beyond work trips, I started planning personal adventures to places I had always dreamed of visiting. A week in Kyoto during cherry blossom season, a road trip along the Amalfi Coast, and a solo weekend in a remote cabin in the Rockies. All of these experiences reminded me of the joy of exploration and the strength of my independence. Each trip felt like a celebration of the life I was building, a life that was entirely mine. I journaled my adventures, capturing not just the sights and sounds, but also the feelings of triumph and gratitude that accompanied each new experience. At home, I continued to nurture my sanctuary. My small garden flourished with vibrant flowers and fragrant herbs, and my bookshelves overflowed with novels and travel guides. Every corner of my house felt alive with my personality, a reflection of the woman I was becoming. As for Mark, he became less and less relevant with each passing day. The occasional updates from mutual acquaintances painted a picture of a man struggling to find his footing. His once polished image was tarnished by the fallout from the lawsuit, and Vanessa's departure had left him even more adrift. But I didn't dwell on his misfortunes. His choices and their consequences were no longer my concern. My energy was focused entirely on my own growth and happiness. One evening, as I sat on my porch with a cup of tea, watching the sun set behind the trees, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. Mark's betrayal had been a turning point, a painful wake-up call that forced me to confront the reality of my life and make a change. But it didn't define me. What defined me was how I had chosen to rise from it, to fight for justice, to reclaim my voice, and to build a life that was rich with purpose and possibility. Every day felt like a reminder of my strength and resilience. I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving. And for the first time in a long time, the future felt like an open canvas, waiting for me to paint it with the vibrant colors of my choosing. As I watched the last rays of sunlight fade into the horizon, a sense of peace settled over me. I had come so far, and I knew that whatever lay ahead, I was ready to embrace it with open arms. A year after the chaos of the lawsuit, the letters, and the process of rebuilding my life, I found myself standing in the wings of an auditorium, clutching a note card with bullet points for my speech. The Women's Empowerment event had reached out months ago, inviting me to share my story with an audience of professionals, survivors, and dreamers who were looking for inspiration. At first, I hesitated. My journey had been deeply personal, and the idea of standing on a stage and recounting the most painful chapter of my life felt daunting. But as I thought about it, I realized how far I had come and how many women might find strength in hearing what I had overcome. When the host introduced me, her words full of praise and encouragement, I stepped onto the stage. The spotlight was warm, illuminating a sea of faces, all waiting to hear what I had to say. My heart raced, but I reminded myself that this was my moment, not just to speak, but to own my story fully. "Good evening," I began, my voice steady despite the butterflies in my stomach. When I was asked to speak here tonight, I wasn't sure where to start. My story, like many of yours, has its share of heartbreak, setbacks, and challenges. But it's also a story of resilience, of rediscovery, and of reclaiming the power that I didn't even realize I had lost. The room was silent, the audience hanging on my every word. I told them about my marriage to Mark, not in exhaustive detail, but enough for them to understand the dynamic of control and manipulation that had defined it. I spoke about the moment he blindsided me with a phone call, announcing our divorce and the illegal sale of our apartment. I thought my world had ended, I admitted. But what I didn't realize in that moment was that it was actually the beginning of something incredible. That call wasn't the end of my story. It was the catalyst for a new chapter. I shared the highs and lows of my journey, the lawsuit, the moments of doubt, and the small victories that had paved the way to the life I was living now. I told them about the day I won back my apartment and the decision to sell it and start fresh. I spoke about the new home I had built, the career opportunities one had seized, and the peace I had found in reconnecting with myself. But what I really want to talk about, I said, pausing to look out at the audience, is the power of choice. Because that's what changed everything for me. For years, I let someone else dictate my worth, my decisions, and my happiness. But when I chose to take back my power, everything shifted, heads nodded in the crowd, and I could see women leaning forward, their expressions a mix of empathy and determination. "Never let anyone take away your power," I continued, my voice growing stronger. "And never let anyone convince you that you're not capable of rising above. The truth is, we're all stronger than we think. Sometimes it takes losing everything to realize how much we're capable of building." The applause was thunderous when I finished. As I stepped back from the microphone, the host returned to the stage, beaming with gratitude. "Thank you, Lauren, for that incredible story," she said, turning to the audience. "If there's one takeaway from tonight, it's that no matter where you start or what you face, you can create a life filled with purpose and joy." As I left the stage, several women approached me, thanking me for sharing my journey. One young woman, barely out of college, told me that my story had given her the courage to leave a toxic relationship she'd been afraid to walk away from. Another woman, in her 60s, said it reminded her that it was never too late to start over. Their words meant the world to me, but the validation I felt didn't come from their praise. It came from knowing that I had turned one of the hardest experiences of my life into something meaningful, not just for me, but for others. Later that night, as I sat in my hotel room overlooking the city lights, I reflected on how much had changed in a year. The woman who had once doubted her worth, who had let someone else dictate her happiness, was gone. In her place was someone who knew her value and wasn't afraid to stand up for it. Mark's betrayal had been a devastating blow, but it had also been the turning point I needed to reclaim my life. And as painful as it was, I was grateful for what it had taught me about resilience, self-worth, and the power of starting over. The future felt brighter than ever, filled with possibilities I hadn't even dreamed of a year ago. The next morning, as I packed my bags and prepared to return home, I glanced at the notebook where I had written my speech. The final line stood out, the words bold and underlined. You define your worth. No one else. It wasn't just a message for the audience. It was a truth I had learned to live by. As I walked out of the hotel and into the crisp morning air, I smiled, ready to embrace whatever came next. The past was behind me, and the future was mine to create.